What if the world's first civilization wasn't the beginning, but a forgotten echo of something even older? What if their gods weren't myths, but memories? Buried beneath the sands of Sumer are 49 mysteries too advanced, too strange, and far too deliberate to explain away with textbooks and polite shrugs. From skyboats to vanished languages, divine court cases to cosmic poetry, this isn't history. This is a glitch in the human timeline. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Welcome to 49 Unsolved Sumerian Mysteries that cannot be explained. Before we dive into the ancient unknown, take a second to subscribe, because you're going to want front row seats to the strangest truths history tried to bury. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? Sunrise in Berlin? 3 a.m. in your blanket fort of existential dread? Let's see who else is wandering the timeline with you. The sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization. Let's set the scene. It's around 4000 BCE, and the rest of the world is still figuring out how not to die of dysentery. Meanwhile, in southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians just appear. Like a software update from the gods. Version 1.0 of human civilization boots up with full administrative features, a temple-based economy, city-states with centralized power, and a stunning lack of bugs. There's even poetry. No slow crawl from hunter-gatherer band to bureaucratic tax hell. No scattered pottery shards leading us gently toward enlightenment. Just boom ziggurats, irrigation, kings, contracts, beer, and existential dread, all up and running like they'd been doing it for centuries. Archaeologists, of course, have tried to sell us the usual. It was environmental, they say, pointing at the Tigris and Euphrates like rivers alone breed social complexity. Others mumble about agricultural surplus and sedentary urban patterns, which is academic for people stopped walking and got nosy. But even these explanations smell suspiciously like retroactive patch notes. Because here's the problem. There is no clear archaeological predecessor. No developmental arc from tribal mud squatters to tablet, scribbling temple accountants. The Ubaid culture existed before the Sumerians, sure, but they were more like the beta testers. There's no continuity strong enough to justify the jump. One day it's beads and baked fish. The next, it's divine kingship and the labor force you can invoice. Some, in hushed tones, whisper about influences from even older lost civilizations, Dilmun, or the ever-vague pre-Sumerians. Others have looked upward, past Orion's belt, into the star-flecked playground of the ancient astronaut theorist crowd. Yes, according to them, aliens had a hand in Sumerian urban planning, because of course they did. And while the extraterrestrial landlord theory is fun for dinner parties, it doesn't explain the real mystery. How does a civilization with no known prequel write itself into history fully formed? With a genre-defining pilot and all? Just as you're reeling from that mystery, take a breath because the language they use to pull it off? It's not related to anything else on Earth. The Sumerian problem. Let's talk about the Sumerian language, a linguistic island, a code in a bottle with no return address. It has no relatives, no cousins, not even a creepy uncle in a neighboring dialect. It's what linguists call a language isolate, which is a polite way of saying, we have absolutely no idea where this came from or who else was speaking anything remotely like it. This is not just a dead language. It's a dead language that left no family tree, no awkward grammar cousins, no borrowed slang. We can't even pin down whether the Sumerians invented it from scratch or picked it up from someone even more mysterious. Imagine a full-blown legal administrative scriptural poetic language dropping into the Bronze Age like a god-tier Wordle solution, and then, poof, no leads. Naturally, scholars have had a field day pretending they're not extremely annoyed by this. Some suggest the Sumerians migrated into Mesopotamia from somewhere else. Central Asia, the Zagros Mountains, Or maybe Atlantis if you've stopped caring entirely. Others insist they were indigenous to the region, meaning they somehow managed to evolve an entire civilizational apparatus and a bespoke language while their neighbors were still decorating clay pots with antlers. But here's where it gets weirder. Even after the Sumerians themselves stopped being a political force, people kept their language alive for religious rites, education, and government documents. Like Latin, if Latin had no Rome, and was preserved solely by bureaucrats with anxiety. And while the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians all borrowed heavily from Sumerian culture, not one of them could trace the linguistic DNA. No precursors, no offshoots, just an immaculately cryptic language fossil, carved into clay. So here's your puzzle. A people we can't place, speaking a language that goes nowhere, and yet somehow shaping the foundation of civilization. And if that doesn't keep you up at night, wait until you hear what they buried under their temples. The purpose of foundation deposits. Imagine you're building a temple, a big one that screams, divine real estate investment. Naturally, you'd want the gods to like it. So, what do? Hire a priest? Sacrifice a goat? Nope. If you're Sumerian, you dig a hole under the cornerstone and bury a tiny tablet, a figurine, maybe some beads, and you do it very, very seriously. These are called foundation deposits, and the Sumerians didn't mess around with them. They're ritual bundles, sealed offerings hidden beneath walls, floors, and ziggurats. Like a sacred time capsule, but instead of childhood drawings and mixtapes, it's cuneiform inscriptions and weird little statues with giant staring eyes. It's as if every major building came with its own buried resume and spiritual insurance policy. So what's the deal? Were these magical anchors? Cosmic IOUs? Were the gods somehow checking zoning permits from the underworld? We're not totally sure. Some tablets describe these deposits as offerings to city gods. Others are more cryptic, mentioning curses upon anyone who disturbs them, a spiritual booby trap, if you will. One theory says they acted as a kind of architectural soul, embedding divine power directly into the structure. Another claims they were record-keeping rituals, ways of marking royal patronage in clay, for eternity, or at least until someone with a shovel got curious. Of course, the modern reaction to finding a buried statuette under a sacred site is usually a mixture of academic excitement and subtle existential dread, because these aren't just symbolic, they feel deliberate, personal, like someone put a part of themselves inside the foundations of their world and then dared future civilizations to understand why. Were the Sumerians hiding something, protecting something, or just playing the long game of divine customer service? The truth is, these little burial bundles show up across time and empires, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to medieval churches. But it all starts here, with the Sumerians, who buried tiny gods under their buildings, and, sometimes, something even more unsettling. Because just a few miles from these deposits, they were also digging mass graves. The royal tombs of Ur-Nammu. Queen Puabi was buried like a legend. Her tomb, discovered in the 1922nd, was filled with jewelry, musical instruments, golden headpieces, and the skeletal remains of at least 74 other people. You know, standard elite burial party etiquette. But the weird part isn't just that people followed her into the afterlife, it's how they got there. Some of these so-called attendants were laid out peacefully, hands folded, expressions calm, as if they'd just decided to nap forever. No signs of trauma, no struggle, which led early archaeologists to assume they willingly drank poison. Because obviously, what's a queen's funeral without some light group suicide? But modern forensic science has a better theory. They were whacked. Specifically, bludgeoned in the back of the head with a blunt object. That's right, Sumerian human sacrifice wasn't just a vibe, it was a logistical operation, an assembly line of death. There were even ramps to wheel the bodies in. Because even in the Bronze Age, project management mattered. Then there's the death pit next door, essentially a trench full of sacrificed attendants, oxen, carts, and instruments. A kind of VIP graveyard mosh pit. Scholars still debate whether these were symbolic rituals, displays of royal power, or just extreme loyalty perks. And if the death pits don't make you feel queasy, perhaps you'd like to read the epic that justified all this pageantry with magical staffs, cosmic power plays, and a mysterious land we're still not sure existed. The meaning of the Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta narrative. Once upon a Sumerian time, two kings had a divine slap fight. On one side, Enmerkar of Uruk, a high-functioning micromanager with delusions of destiny. On the other, the Lord of Aratta, a ruler of a distant, possibly fictional city rich in jewels, arrogance, and narrative ambiguity. What unfolds is a strange tale of diplomatic pettiness, magical technology, and cosmic one-upmanship. Instead of war, they wage a battle of wills, using riddles, messengers, incantations, and a staff of justice that may or may not be a magical USB stick. There are boasts, impossible demands, and even an incantation that some scholars believe refers to the invention of writing itself, which, in this story, is basically deployed as passive-aggressive divine text messaging. But what was the point? Is Aratta a metaphor? A mythical memory of a real place? A parable about ego and the dangers of remote management? Or was it a deeply coded political allegory, no longer decipherable now that we've all forgotten how to read economic metaphors in Sumerian? Even the ending is fuzzy. Did Enmerkar win? Did Aratta cave? Did the messenger make it back alive? What we do know is that Aratta disappears whether into legend or geography. Nobody knows. But as with all things Sumerian, when the city fades, poetry steps in to weep. The Lament for Ur. Enter the emo mixtape of ancient Mesopotamia. The Lament for Ur is a haunting, poetic howl written by a priestess watching her beloved city fall apart like an over-leveraged housing project. Temples crumble, gods flee, ash rains down on ziggurats. It's metal, and it's weirdly intimate. On paper, it's a eulogy for a ruined city, but between the lines, there's more going on. The gods are portrayed not just as powerful beings, but as petty, emotionally unavailable landlords who abandon Ur in its hour of need. There's anger, betrayal, and a very specific sort of sadness, the kind that only comes from realizing your sacred capital is now just a well-decorated pile of dust. But the language? It's layered in cosmic symbolism. The destruction isn't just physical, it's metaphysical. The earth mourns, the sky turns away, the cosmic balance shatters. It's not just a historical moment, it's a theological crisis with lyrical footnotes. Modern scholars see it as political propaganda, trauma processing, or maybe just a celestial breakup letter. Either way, it's too poetic to be mere history and too raw to be myth. It's something in between. And if that wasn't enough existential dread for one day, wait until you see the architectural enigma shaped like a divine question mark, the true function of temple ovals. Of all the oddities the Sumerians left behind, few are as geometrically unsettling as the temple oval. Imagine you're an archaeologist. You've been digging up square temple foundations all month, maybe dreaming about something spicy like a step pyramid or an unusually shaped altar. Then suddenly, you hit this, an enormous walled enclosure, oval in shape, centered around a temple like some kind of cosmic petri dish. These aren't casual ovals. These are enormous, deliberate, labor-intensive curves of baked brick and stone. There's no shortcut in building an oval with Bronze Age tools. It's the architectural equivalent of drawing a perfect circle with a chisel and then insisting your gods really needed it that way. Only a handful of these structures have ever been found, mostly in cities like Kafaja and Lagash, and no one really knows why they were built this way. They don't fit the usual Sumerian temple mold. No ziggurat, no obvious bureaucratic function, and weirdly, no consistent religious text about their significance. Just big, beautiful, purposefully oval precincts with central shrines, like the gods wanted their worship venues to resemble giant eyeballs staring up at the sky. Theories range from the plausible to the speculative. Maybe they were designed for open-air ceremonies. Maybe they had astronomical alignments. Maybe the oval shape represented the cosmic egg, a primordial womb, or the layout of divine space. Or maybe, just maybe, they were Sumerian attempts at traffic control for sacred livestock. One particularly spicy theory suggests that temple ovals were liminal zones, designed as spaces where the divine could manifest in physical form, essentially, supernatural landing pads. The temples at the center were just the core, while the oval enclosure served as a buffer between the divine energy and the dirty mortal world. Which is both impressive and terrifying, depending on how often you think about the words divine containment field. Whatever their purpose, the Sumerians didn't build many, which either means they were incredibly important or a colossal waste of resources, possibly both. And when scholars ask why the tradition stopped, they're met with the usual Sumerian response: poetic ambiguity, unanswered questions, and a suspicious change of subject. So what could follow an oval-shaped riddle in mud brick? How about a document that mixes myth, math, and monarchy, all while claiming that one guy ruled for 36,000 years? The King List and its mythological early reigns. The Sumerian King List is the ancient equivalent of a dynastic Wikipedia page if Wikipedia were edited by poets, priests, and maybe one or two extremely drunk time travelers. Etched into tablets and copied for centuries, the King List starts off deceptively normal. Names of rulers, durations of reign, cities in power. But then, somewhere around the third entry, history takes a sharp left turn into the Twilight Zone. The first kings ruled for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. One guy allegedly sat on the throne for 36,000 years. Another? A modest 18,600. You know, casual Sunday job tenures. It's myth mixed with math. Myth, math. And no one can quite agree where the fiction ends and the history begins. Some scholars suggest that the absurdly long reigns were symbolic, not literal, representing dynastic legitimacy, cosmological eras, or ritual time. Others think they reflect garbled memories of real events, passed down orally and inflated to absurdity through sheer reverence and regional pride. And a few people, bless their hearts, believe these numbers are literal, which implies the early kings were immortal alien hybrid beings with excellent job security. But here's where it gets trickier. After the flood, yes, that flood, the reigns suddenly become more believable. Instead of tens of thousands of years, kings start ruling for 20, 30, 40 years. Something resets. The mythic timeline fractures into something that almost resembles historical record. So now we're stuck with a list that begins in a world where men lived like gods and ends in a world where gods had to file paperwork. Why was this list made? Was it a teaching tool? A political justification for city-state supremacy? A sacred genealogy meant to tie the present to a golden, if entirely fictional past? No one knows. But it reads less like a ledger and more like a carefully curated origin myth disguised as bureaucracy. And while we puzzle over its numerical absurdities, there's another mystery waiting in the shadows about how people were doing math, commerce, and statecraft before they even had a proper alphabet. The Proto-Literate period's administrative systems. Before the Sumerians invented cuneiform, before styluses and tablets, and the satisfying crunch of bureaucratic permanence, they were already organizing the mess of civilization, not with words, but with tokens. Lots and lots of tokens. Picture it, tiny clay balls, cones, discs, and cylinders, each with its own meaning, its own value. These weren't toys or game pieces, These were the ancient world's first spreadsheets. Someone in a reed hut was managing livestock and grain using what amounts to a three-dimensional accounting system. These tokens were stored in clay envelopes called bulle hollow balls, with tokens sealed inside and impressions made on the outside. If that sounds convoluted, that's because it was, but it worked. You could shake a bulla and hear the rattle of your future tax obligations. Eventually, someone decided to skip the 3D and just press the shapes into clay. Thus, proto-writing was born. But here's the twist. This system wasn't used for poetry, or prayers, or philosophy. It was used for inventory, meaning that humanity's first steps into written communication were driven not by inspiration, but by bureaucracy. Civilization didn't emerge because we wanted to tell stories. It emerged because we needed receipts. And yet, we still don't fully understand the leap from tokens to writing. Did the symbols evolve directly from the shapes? Were they used side by side? Why did it happen when it did? And why are so many of the earliest inscriptions about barley? Scholars argue about the sequence of development, about whether it was a smooth transition or a technological mutation. Some think the token system survived well into the cuneiform period. Others think it was abruptly replaced. All we know is that by the time writing hit its stride, the proto-literate accountants had already invented the logic of the ledger. So there you have it. Before epic tales, there were spreadsheets. Before myths, there was math. And before the gods walked the earth, someone had to count the goats. And speaking of floods literal and metaphysical, our next stop is the Great Deluge that nearly washed away all of it. Or maybe didn't, depending on which god you ask. The Great Flood, narrative's origin. There are floods, and then there are capital F floods, the kind that wipe civilizations off the map and leave nothing behind but soggy myths and survivors with suspiciously detailed memories. The Sumerians had one of those, or at least they claimed they did. Their flood story is the earliest known version of a narrative you probably already know. An angry god, a righteous man, an ark full of animals, and a whole lot of drowning. Only in this version, the hero isn't Noah. He's called Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, depending on which tablet you wake up with in your excavation trench. The basic plot remains unnervingly consistent. The gods grow annoyed with humanity's noise and chaos, which, to be fair, is relatable. So they decide to drown everyone. But one chosen guy gets tipped off by a sympathetic deity, usually Enki, and is told to build a boat, save life forms, and ride out the divine hissy fit. After the waters recede, he's rewarded with immortality, which honestly seems like overcompensation for surviving a planetary reset. Now, the fun begins when you try to sort out what parts of this story are history and what parts are well flooded with theological metaphor. Some argue that the Sumerians based the myth on a real flood, possibly one caused by the violent overflow of the Tigris and Euphrates. It's plausible. The region was notorious for catastrophic floods that turned entire cityscapes into swampy graveyards, but a flood that wiped out all humanity except for one extremely lucky guy on a divine yacht? That's a harder sell. Others suggest that the myth is a kind of spiritual reformatting tool, a symbolic way to explain why old gods get fired, cities fall, and new dynasties need a narrative reset. The flood, in this reading, is the Mesopotamian version of, have you tried turning civilization off and back on again? What's uncanny is how this story echoes across cultures. Babylonians, Hebrews, Greeks, even the Hindus and Norse all have their own flood tales. Same themes, same righteous survivor. Same ocean of death. Were they all inspired by the Sumerians? Or is this some kind of shared trauma encoded in the collective unconscious? Either way, the flood isn't the end. It's just the moment before the gods start rewriting the rules. And the next myth proves it, because the gods offer humanity the one thing we claim to want, and then make us regret it. The Adapa and the South Wind myths implications. Adapa is one of those characters who seems ordinary until you realize he ruined immortality for everyone. The story goes like this. Adapa is a high priest of Eridu, devoted to the god Enki. He's wise, loyal, divinely educated, and basically the ideal intern. One day, while fishing, he breaks the south wind's wings. Yes, apparently the wind has wings because it wrecked his boat. Casual divine assault. Now, this is where things get weird. Instead of smiting him on the spot, the gods invite Adapa to heaven for a sit-down. This is not normal. The Anunnaki usually don't hand out appointments. But Enki warns him ahead of time. Don't eat or drink anything they offer you. It's a trap. So Adapa goes, refuses the food and drink, and returns to Earth, proud of having resisted temptation. Unfortunately, he just rejected the bread and water of eternal life. Turns out, it wasn't a trap, it was a gift. A cosmic screw-up of mythological proportions. This story hits like an existential prank. A man so obedient, so loyal, so trusting, that he unintentionally sabotages the future of human mortality. We were this close to pulling an Elrond and living forever in our elven cities. Instead, we got taxes, aging, and arthritis. The myth plays out like a theological riddle. Who's at fault? Adapa, for trusting bad advice? Enki, for giving it? Or the system itself, which punishes obedience with death and disobedience with punishment anyway? Some scholars interpret the tale as an early commentary on divine injustice, a cosmic reminder that gods don't always play fair, and that being good doesn't guarantee anything but ironic consequences. Others see it as an allegory for the human condition. We are wise enough to serve the gods, but never wise enough to understand their logic. And just to add salt to the metaphysical wound, Adapa doesn't even protest. He accepts his fate, returns to his duties, and fades into theological footnotes, just a man who said no to paradise because he thought it was poisoned wine. If myths are mirrors, this one is cracked. And speaking of divine punishments and unexplained collapses, there's an entire empire next on the chopping block, and the Sumerians had some very poetic ideas about why it fell. The Curse of Akkad and its historical accuracy. Imagine your empire is collapsing. Famine, rebellion, cities burning, roads clogged with refugees. Do you blame poor economic planning, climate instability, corrupt leadership? If you're a Sumerian priest scribe, you blame the gods. Specifically, you say they cursed the entire region because the king got too arrogant and tried to touch something holy he shouldn't have. And thus was born the Curse of Akkad. This poetic lament, part myth, part political hit job, tells the story of how Naram-Sin, grandson of Sargon the Great, led Akkad into ruin by committing the ultimate taboo, attacking the sacred city of Nippur and desecrating its temple. In doing so, he earned the wrath of Enlil, who responded not with a slap on the wrist, but with a full divine apocalypse. Crops withered. Armies failed. Gods abandoned their shrines. The land itself turned against its people. It's a classic narrative twist, a mighty empire undone not by its enemies, but by its hubris. It's also suspiciously convenient. Historically, the fall of Akkad likely had more to do with things like drought, overextension, and those pesky Gutians from the mountains. But the Sumerians weren't about to let something as mundane as realpolitik ruin a good story. So they reframed it. The gods cursed Akkad because the king got too bold. The moral? Don't mess with sacred architecture. The poem is rich with irony and despair. Naram-Sin prays, weeps, sacrifices, nothing works. The gods ignore him like an X blocking your number. And when it's all over, the land lies in silence, the empire broken, and the only thing left standing is the bitter lesson carved into clay. The Curse of Akkad might not be historically accurate in the Netflix docudrama sense, but it's emotionally true. It captures something timeless about the way civilizations try to make sense of collapse. Not with spreadsheets, but with stories. And as one city fell, another mourned. because in Mesopotamia, no tragedy was complete without a second opinion, and Nippur had a lot to say about its own destruction. The Nippur Lament and its unique aspects. Nippur wasn't just any city, it was the city. The theological Switzerland of Sumer, a neutral, sacred zone that every king, no matter how power-hungry, wanted to be on good terms with. Because Nippur wasn't known for its military strength or spicy nightlife, it was known for being the home of Enlil, king of the gods and cosmic HR manager. If Enlil liked your city, you thrived. If he didn't, well, get ready to file for divine bankruptcy. So when the Nippur Lament rolls around, it hits different. This isn't just the story of a city being sacked, it's a metaphysical crisis. Nippur wasn't supposed to fall. If Nippur fell, it meant the moral and spiritual order of the universe itself had hit a critical error. The lament is written like a love letter to a crumbling institution. Temples are described as weeping. Statues mourn. The very streets feel abandoned by their own purpose. And in the middle of all this divine chaos, the authors ask, how could this happen to Nippur? If the sacred seat of divine authority could be leveled, what chance did anyone else have? Unlike the Lament for Ur, which has a wider apocalyptic tone, the Nippur Lament feels oddly intimate. It reads more like a betrayal narrative, a divine ghosting. Enlil himself is portrayed as absent, silent, maybe even complicit, and that silence is the most haunting part, because without divine favor, Nippur is just bricks and ash. Some scholars argue that the text serves as a kind of theological therapy, helping its authors process the trauma of a system that failed. Others think it was political commentary, an indirect critique of kings who had messed with the city's sanctity. Either way, it's deeply reflective and unsettling. Not because the city fell, but because it wasn't supposed to. And while the lament ends with vague hopes of restoration, there's no triumphant return, no divine promise of rebuilding, just silence, smoke, and questions. But as Nippur's gods walked out, another mystery walked in from below, because in the Sumerian worldview, when the heavens abandon you, you're left staring into the underworld. And it's staring back. The House of Darkness, or underworld descriptions. In Sumerian cosmology, the afterlife was not a place of harps and halos. It was more like an eternal waiting room with terrible lighting and no customer service desk. Welcome to Kur, the House of Darkness, where the dead go, and go, and go, but never quite arrive at anything resembling peace. Descriptions of Kur are scattered across texts like shards of a broken mirror. There's no clean map, no user manual. What we get are snapshots, a vast, dusty plain beneath the earth, ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, and guarded by gala demons who really enjoy their jobs a little too much. The dead are described as bird-like, feeding on dust and silence. There are no rewards, no punishments, just an infinite, bureaucratic stillness. Some interpretations see this as a metaphor for decay and oblivion. Others take it at face value. The Sumerians literally believed you became a dusty pigeon person upon death, endlessly pacing the gloom. But here's where things get delightfully weird. The underworld wasn't always strictly separate from the living. There are rituals, incantations, and even summoning protocols. Dead kings could be consulted. Ghosts could be bribed. And in a few rare cases, travelers like Inana could descend into Kur and come back, though not without consequences. What's even more baffling is that Kur wasn't necessarily evil, just indifferent, cold, legalistic, a cosmic DMV where your number is never called. Morality didn't determine your afterlife, fate status did. And even that didn't get you much. Despite being a central concept, Kur remains maddeningly vague. Some texts describe 7 gates, Others describe rivers, barriers, or even mountainous terrain. It shifts like a dream, consistent in tone, but unreliable in geography, which makes perfect sense for a civilization that saw death as both an end and an eternal contract. So if you're hoping for clarity, you're not going to find it here. Just endless clay tablets hinting at a realm where hope goes to be outlived. But let's leave the dust ghosts behind and step into something equally cryptic. Only this time, it's written not in symbols of death, but in the legal codes of the living. The nature of Sumerian legal precedents and common law. Before the law was codified in stone and handed out like cosmic parking tickets, it was negotiated, remembered, argued, and chiseled into clay by Sumerian scribes with surprisingly sophisticated ideas about justice and a shocking lack of chill. Sumerian legal thought predates the famed Code of Hammurabi by centuries, but unlike that Babylonian hit single, Sumerian law was messier. It existed in fragments, case decisions, decrees, proverbs, and contracts. There wasn't one single code. There were hundreds, and they didn't always agree with each other. What we know is that the Sumerians loved legal nuance. Disputes about land, marriage, contracts, debt, and inheritance show up in the archives of cities like Ur, Lagash, and Umma. These weren't just template-based decisions either. Judges weighed evidence, questioned witnesses, and occasionally reversed earlier rulings. In other words, precedent mattered. And while many laws seem harsh, for example, theft often earned you a cozy spot in the underworld, there's a surprising flexibility built into the system. Compensation and restitution were emphasized. Fines could replace corporal punishment. Some decisions were even tailored to the social class or gender of the participants, both incredibly forward-thinking and deeply problematic, depending on your vantage point. There's also a strange obsession with oaths. Need to settle a land dispute? Swear on a river god? Got caught stealing goats? Swear on Enlil. If that sounds like a legal system built on a mix of divine threat and wishful thinking, you're not wrong. The laws reveal a world trying desperately to balance the chaos of life with the order of the divine. And doing it all without precedent in the modern sense, just scribes, tablets, and a collective cultural memory as the legal backbone. But perhaps the most telling thing is this. Many of the disputes we find recorded inheritance, squabbles, property line arguments, contract breaches are exactly the kinds of problems we still have today. The only difference? The Sumerians had to write everything in cuneiform, on wet clay, while probably being judged by a priest with a very long beard. And just when you think you've escaped the dry world of Sumerian law, the next set of tablets greets you with riddles, literal ones, with punchlines no one's been able to figure out. The Sumerian riddles. You're sitting in a dim room lit by oil lamps, surrounded by students in clay-smudged robes, and someone slides a freshly baked cuneiform tablet across the table with a smirk. On it, a riddle. Maybe about a fox, maybe about beer, maybe about bodily functions. The punchline? Long gone. Welcome to the frustratingly hilarious world of Sumerian riddles, the ancient equivalent of, "Why did the chicken cross the road?" with half the sentence erased and the rest written in a dead language. Sumerian riddles, preserved mostly on school tablets and occasionally in more formal texts, are some of the oldest examples of written humor, which is both delightful and infuriating. Delightful because it proves the Sumerians had a sense of humor. Infuriating because most of the time we don't get it. The context is missing. The punchlines are obscure. And the answers? Often absent entirely. What we do know is that they played with puns, metaphor, and absurd imagery. Some seem to rely on slapstick. A house with no door. What is it? While others veer into the poetic or surreal. The thing that eats but is never full, that drinks but is always thirsty. You think you're solving a riddle, but really you're standing in front of a 4,000-year-old Sumerian stand-up act with no subtitles. There's evidence these riddles were used in education, both as mnemonic tools and as a kind of entertainment intellectual wrestling matches to keep apprentice scribes on their toes. After all, if you're going to spend decades mastering the world's most tedious writing system, you might as well have a laugh along the way. And while some riddles have survived well enough for scholars to hazard a guess at the answers, others remain opaque. One of the most cited ends with, "He entered the house and didn't come out. What is it?" Theories range from a date pit to a nose, which says less about the riddle and more about how desperate modern translators are. But even without full translations, these riddles speak volumes. They show that the Sumerians didn't just write about gods and taxes. They joked, they teased, they enjoyed a little confusion. And they wanted their students to think critically, preferably while laughing. Still, if you think Sumerian humor was strange, wait until you read their agricultural advice manuals. Because somehow, even farming became a mystery. The Farmer's Almanac and its agricultural details. Imagine you're a Sumerian farmer. You've got a plow made of wood, an ox that occasionally listens, and a field that floods just enough to ruin everything. You don't have Google. You have the Sumerian Farmer's Almanac, a text equal parts instruction manual, folk wisdom, and ancient passive-aggressive coaching. This agricultural guide is more than just a planting calendar. It's a step-by-step breakdown of the farming year, told with the voice of a grumpy veteran farmer who's seen one too many barley disasters. Do not plow when the soil is too wet, it warns, unless you enjoy being mocked by your neighbors. Okay, that last part might be implied. What's remarkable is how thorough it island. It outlines when to till, when to plant, how to prepare irrigation ditches, how to manage oxen, how to avoid letting your field turn into a goat buffet. It even advises on harvesting techniques, crop rotation, and the ideal shape of your furrows. These were not amateurs. These were proto-agronomists with mud on their sandals and tablets in their hands. And yet, there's something else buried beneath the surface, something almost ritualistic. Certain sections of the text read more like liturgy than logistics. Repetitions, symbolic numbers, invocations of natural forces. It raises the question, was this really just farming advice? Or was it also a kind of religious calendar disguised as instructions? Some scholars suggest these texts were intended for temple estates, where farming wasn't just economic, but also spiritual. You weren't just growing food, you were feeding the gods. Every furrow was an offering. Every harvest, a divine transaction. But like much of Sumerian life, this almanac leaves us unsure. Where does practical stop and mystical begin? Was the instruction to drive the oxen in a straight line a technical note or a cosmic metaphor? And then there's the tone, sarcastic, specific, suspiciously personal. Do not allow the plowman to drink beer before the work is done. Clearly someone had that problem on staff. So here it is, part agricultural guide, part spiritual contract, part early workplace complaint log. And if you think giving barley a personality is a stretch, wait till you see what happens when barley and sheep get into a philosophical debate. The Sumerian debate poems. Yes, you read that right. The Sumerians wrote debate poems. These weren't courtroom dramas or intellectual brawls in the agora. These were dialogues between inanimate objects, animals, concepts arguing, often quite viciously, about who was more essential to civilization. Grain versus sheep, bird versus fish, summer versus winter, hoe versus plow. If it existed, it probably got into a fight on a clay tablet. Each poem follows a familiar structure. Two parties present their case to a divine judge, usually Enlil, who then issues a ruling on which is superior. The arguments are passionate, detailed, and eerily human. Grain boasts of feeding the people and being the foundation of temple offerings. Sheep counters with wool, milk, and warm clothing. Fish scoffs at bird's vanity. Bird accuses fish of being smelly and hard to catch. It's like watching a divine courtroom version of Judge Judy, but with more livestock. The point of these poems isn't just humor, though there's plenty of that. They're deeply symbolic reflections on balance, hierarchy, and the interdependence of nature and culture. Each character represents a pillar of society: agriculture, animal husbandry, seasonal cycles, and through their conflict, the Sumerians explored moral and practical tensions. And then, in the end, the god picks a winner. Just like that. Divine verdict delivered. One side walks away smug, the other humbled. It's educational, sure, but also deeply unfair, because Enlil clearly plays favorites. But there's a darker subtext here too. The debates are a way to frame inequality. Some things win, others lose. And not because they're wrong, but because the system says so. It's civilization through allegory, and also a kind of cosmic bureaucracy. So, if you've ever watched two coworkers argue about who's more essential to the company, congratulations, you've participated in a Sumerian genre. And if metaphysical courtroom dramas aren't surreal enough for you, hold on, because next comes a concept so abstract, it makes divine debates look like schoolyard spats. We're about to meet the mysterious powers that define the universe itself, and no one really knows how they worked. The meaning of me, divine decrees, powers. The Emmy. Those mysterious divine decrees that sound like they should be part of a tech startup but instead govern everything in existence. Law, kingship, weaving, prostitution, accounting, temple construction, gossip, yes, gossip all fall under the domain of the ME. Imagine if reality were a software package, and each essential function came as a cosmic app, all pre-installed by the gods, with no option to uninstall or disable. That's the ME. In Sumerian mythology, these aren't just abstract concepts. The ME are treated like physical objects, tangible tablets or tokens handed down by the gods, stolen, fought over, transported on boats, even dropped in rivers. Divine USB drives loaded with the firmware of the universe. But here's the confusing part. No one agrees on how they work. Are they metaphors? Magic artifacts? Bureaucratic scrolls signed in divine ink? Their origin is never quite explained, and their distribution feels suspiciously arbitrary. Enki, the trickster god of wisdom, seems to hoard a bunch of them. Then he hands them off to Inana after a few too many drinks, literally sparking a divine redistribution of power that reads like a cross between a heist movie and a cosmic rave. Each ME governs a specific realm: music, fear, destruction, carpentry, debate, and about 90 other functions that together create the totality of civilized life. But the ME don't just define society, they define identity. To possess a ME is to embody that domain. If you control the ME of kingship, you don't just have political power, you are political power. Which makes the whole thing terrifyingly fragile. If the ME can be stolen, lost, or transferred, does that mean reality is negotiable? Is civilization itself just one forgotten token away from collapse? There's also the issue of hierarchy. Some ME are clearly more elite than others. Warfare outranks brewing. Writing outpaces pottery. And yet, all are vital. It's a theocratic tech stack with no clear administrator and zero documentation. And while modern scholars still debate what the ME actually were, ritual scripts, symbolic laws, cosmic metaphors, the Sumerians treated them with reverence and fear, because whoever holds the ME holds the world. And in a world built on control, you better mark your boundaries clearly. Which brings us to a whole different kind of boundary. The kind carved in stone, infused with curses, and policed by divine iconography. Welcome to the Kudurru, the precise purpose of Kudurrus. At first glance, a Kudurru looks like a gravestone for someone very bureaucratic and not particularly missed. It's a carved stone monument, usually inscribed with land grants, legal agreements, or royal favors. But look closer, and things get weird. These stones aren't just paperwork, they're enchanted paperwork. Kudurrus served as boundary markers and official records, documenting who owned what land, under what divine authority, and with how much divine wrath backing it up. Because, yes, most Kudurrus end with something like, "May Enlil curse the one who moves this stone, may Ninurta smite their crops. May their descendants forget how to count." Legal threats delivered with poetic flair. But these stones didn't just name names. They also featured elaborate iconography, astronomical symbols, divine emblems, and terrifying creatures forming a visual language that screamed, "Don't mess with this contract," in 50 mythological dialects. It's a lawsuit filed directly with the gods. Despite the dramatic flair, the legal function is clear. The Kudurru was a permanent, unforgeable record, literally set in stone, meant to be seen, feared, and respected. It didn't matter if the local peasants were illiterate, the gods were not, and they were always watching. But here's the philosophical kicker. The Kudurru blurs the line between law and magic. It's not just about property, it's about power. Whoever had the Kudurru didn't just own the land, they had cosmic legitimacy. Their authority was sanctified by divine forces, and if anyone disagreed, well, curses happen. Some Kudurrus even include miniature mythologies, narratives explaining why the land was given, what happened in previous disputes, and how divine favor played a role. Their land deeds wrapped in theocratic storytelling, turning a simple boundary line into an epic of legitimacy. We don't know how widespread their use was. We don't know who carved them, who commissioned them, or how often they were enforced. But we do know one thing: they weren't just practical. They were performative, like slamming a holy gavel into the soil. And speaking of divine performance, there's one story where the gods did actually perform organizing the world piece by piece like a mythological startup. It's neat, it's detailed, and it's somehow still confusing. The Enki and the World Order narrative. Here's the scene. The universe has been created, but it's still chaos. The gods are wandering around bumping into things. Rivers don't know where to flow, and nobody has assigned a job to the god of pickaxes yet. Enter Enki, god of wisdom, water, and clever life hacks. In the myth of Enki and the World Order, our hero doesn't create the world from scratch, he organizes it, which is somehow even more impressive. Enki is like the celestial HR department, doling out job titles, cosmic jurisdictions, and divine job descriptions with smug precision. Marshlands go here, cities go there, cattle gods get their fields. Grain goddesses get their silos. Everyone gets a LinkedIn endorsement and a heavenly inbox. It's tidy, bureaucratic, and strangely satisfying until, of course, someone gets left out. Enter Inana, the goddess of love, war, and not being ignored. She confronts Enki about why she didn't get more cosmic clout, and suddenly, the myth shifts from administrative rollout to divine sibling rivalry. This isn't just a story about function. It's a story about power, who gets to assign meaning, who gets to claim authority, and what happens when the balance is disrupted. Enki's allocations aren't just practical. They're political. The myth becomes a reflection of Sumerian society itself, hierarchical, symbolic, and dangerously dependent on everyone knowing their place. And yet, it's not all neat resolutions. Enki's world order ends on a sour note. Inanna's complaint isn't fully resolved. There's no triumphant return or cosmic apology. The narrative just ends, with a lingering sense that the divine system might look stable, but it's always one ignored goddess away from full-blown rebellion. Scholars argue about the myth's function. Was it a legitimization of temple structures? A ritual play? A philosophical allegory? The truth is, it works on all levels. It's an origin myth that doesn't explain creation, but structure. A cosmic to-do list disguised as scripture. And just when you think divine politics couldn't get more morally murky, the Sumerians introduce a goddess whose resume includes social justice and possibly PR damage control. The Nanshe hymn and its social justice themes. If the Sumerian pantheon were a corporate boardroom, Most deities would be arguing over temples, territory, and who gets the next batch of incense. But Nanshe? She was the quiet department head in the corner, reading petitions from widows and rescuing orphans while the rest of the gods squabbled about who invented beer. The hymn to Nanshe paints a rare and genuinely refreshing picture in the otherwise unforgiving terrain of Mesopotamian theology. Nanshe isn't just a goddess of divination and dreams, she's also the overseer of justice for the voiceless. A divine advocate for the poor, the displaced, the prisoner, the debt-ridden, and the socially forgotten. It's like if the IRS and Amnesty International had a baby and gave her a shrine. The hymn describes her temple as a place of refuge, a courtroom, and a soup kitchen all rolled into one. People come to her for judgments. The blind are brought to her for healing. She listens to the cries of those burdened by injustice. In short, she actually gives a damn, which is more than can be said for most of her divine peers. So, what's the catch? There's always a catch. Despite the strong moral tone of the hymn, we have little evidence that Sumerian society truly lived up to Nanshe's values. Legal texts and administrative documents still reflect a culture deeply stratified by class, gender, and property. If anything, the hymn may function less as a record of daily practice and more as aspirational propaganda. Look how just we are, our goddess says so. Or maybe it's a case of ritual compartmentalization. Nanshe handles the morality part so the rest of the system can remain profitably indifferent. You get your cosmic conscience, and the temple still collects grain taxes on schedule. Regardless, the hymn is rare in tone, empathetic, sincere, almost shockingly modern in its appeal to human dignity, and that alone makes it a mystery. Was Nanshe truly central to daily worship? Or was she a theological niche carved out for the sake of divine PR? Either way, her temple stood as a symbol of hope in a brutal world. And sitting inside that temple, watching your prayers rise with the incense, were rows of eerie, wide-eyed figures that didn't blink because they were made of gypsum. The significance of gypsum statues with inlaid eyes. Step into a Sumerian temple, and you'll likely find yourself face to face with an unnerving congregation. Not worshippers, but statues. Dozens of them. Small, gypsum-bodied figures with their hands clasped in prayer and their eyes impossibly wide, inlaid with shell and black stone. They stare, permanently, endlessly. At you, at the gods, at the horizon of meaning. These aren't just decorative items. They're stand-ins, perpetual worshippers commissioned to pray on behalf of the living. Can't make it to temple every day? No problem. Just pay a sculptor to carve your eternal doppelganger, place it near the altar, and let those bug-eyed little guys handle your spiritual responsibilities for the rest of time. But the more you look at them, the stranger they get. Why the exaggerated eyes? Is it devotion? Fear? Cosmic overstimulation? Do they reflect the all-seeing gaze of the gods, or the hopeful vigilance of mortals watching for divine attention? Some scholars suggest these statues don't just represent the worshipper, they become them, metaphysically, not just avatars, proxies, vessels. The materials tell their own story. Gypsum is soft, easy to shape, but prone to decay, almost like flesh. The inlays, though, are durable and vivid. The eyes remain long after the body crumbles, as if the gaze itself was the most important offering. There's also the unsettling uniformity. Men, women, even children all rendered with the same intense devotional stare. Were these mass-produced? Was this piety industrialized? Or was there an aesthetic formula for what acceptable worship looked like? We don't have records explaining who decided what expressions the statues should have. Were they customized to the buyer? Did the sculptor add extra intensity for a higher price? Or did everyone just agree that wide-eyed, sleepless reverence was the default mode of piety? Regardless, these statues filled temples for centuries, silent, staring, unblinking messengers between the human and divine. and their presence still radiates something unsettling. Faith turned into permanence, prayer frozen in time, eyes that outlive their owners. And if you think the statues were strange, wait until you meet the tiny cylinders that told whole stories in a single roll like comic books for bureaucrats and gods alike. The prevalence of cylinder seals and their iconographic meaning. Behold the cylinder seal, a tiny, unassuming artifact that held more narrative weight than most blockbuster scripts. Small enough to hang from a necklace, but powerful enough to seal contracts, authorize transactions, and depict mythological battles in a single seamless roll. These seals were the Swiss Army knives of the ancient world. Made from stone or sometimes precious materials, carved in reverse with intricate designs, they were pressed into wet clay to create an impression, a unique signature, a scene, a declaration of power. Every official had one. Every deal needed one. Every god probably had a favorite. But here's where the mystery sets in. Many seals show more than just names or symbols. They depict complex iconography, gods, wrestling monsters, humans kneeling before celestial beings, star maps, rituals, divine feasts, apocalyptic visions, and things that look suspiciously like flying machines, if you've had enough wine. What were these scenes meant to convey? Were they storytelling, personal branding, spiritual bookmarks? Some seals seem to record real events, others are symbolic or purely mythic, and some are so abstract that no one has the faintest idea what they were trying to say. Then there's the matter of ownership. Was your seal just a tool or a kind of identity? Did it say something about your role in society, your patron deity, your level of access to the divine Slack channel? Losing your seal was a serious matter. It meant losing your signature, your status, your face in the administrative crowd. And still, these tiny objects remain some of the richest sources of Sumerian visual culture. They tell us what mattered: legitimacy, the gods, hierarchy, cosmology, control. And unlike grandiose inscriptions, they were intimate, worn, handled, passed down, lost. Miniature epics, spinning like rolling prayers across soft clay. Some scholars liken them to passports, others to business cards, but they're more than that. They are the fingerprints of a civilization obsessed with order, myth, and symbolism. And sometimes, those fingerprints led straight into myth, like the story of a king who disappeared into the mountains, turned into legend, and maybe, just maybe, became something more than human. The Lugalbanda epics and their historical, mythological blend. Lugalbanda, warrior, king, husband of Inana, possible demigod, definite enigma. His name appears in the Sumerian king list as a ruler of Uruk who reigned for hundreds of years, which, as we've already established, was standard HR policy for divine-favored monarchs. But unlike most semi-fictional rulers, Lugalbanda gets 2 epic poems. That's right, 2 full-length sagas packed with divine intervention, supernatural speedruns, and enough mountain drama to make him the Mesopotamian answer to a Tolkien character. In Lugalbanda, in the mountain cave, our hero gets sick while on a military expedition and is left behind by his army in, you guessed it, a cave. There, he prays Allah. He begs for healing from the gods, offers sacrifices, and possibly invents the solo spiritual retreat, centuries before it became trendy. Then, he miraculously recovers, seemingly enhanced, and in the second poem, Lugalbanda and the Anzud bird, he makes a friend. That friend is a terrifying, divine, lion-headed eagle, because of course, it island. Lugalbanda doesn't just survive in the wilderness, he thrives. He wins the loyalty of mythical beasts, gains divine favor, and develops the ability to run faster than the wind, covering days of distance in hours. By the time he rejoins his comrades, he's basically become a one-man divine delivery service. And as a bonus, he helps broker peace in a political deadlock between cities. So, was Lugalbanda a real king, a spiritual archetype, or an exaggerated folk hero? The lines blur deliberately. The epics are filled with historically grounded details, place names, diplomatic concerns, military logistics, but also with overt magic, prayer, and impossible feats. It's a biographical mashup. 1 part political allegory, 2 parts divine myth, and a sprinkle of wilderness fantasy. He's also notable for being, well, humble. Unlike Gilgamesh, who treats divine boundaries like personal challenges, Lugalbanda spends most of his time asking the gods nicely. He fasts, he prays, he waits. He doesn't demand greatness, he earns it by being a respectful little cog in the cosmic wheel, and somehow that makes him more powerful. But when a story ends with a man returning from the wilderness, not just alive but supernaturally gifted, you start wondering, what else was hiding in those mountains? What else didn't make it into the clay? And speaking of missing pieces, we now arrive at the oldest Sumerian creation story, told in fragments so incomplete, it feels like the gods were actively trying to erase it from memory. The Eridu Genesis, and its fragmentary nature. If you were hoping the Sumerians had a tidy, well-preserved creation myth that lays out the birth of the universe in chronological order, you're thinking of other cultures with more durable filing systems. What we have instead is the Eridu Genesis, a tantalizingly incomplete creation myth that arrives like a badly torn cosmic screenplay. The clay tablets that survive give us brief, gorgeous glimpses, then drop off mid-sentence like a prophet who got interrupted by a very poorly timed flood. The text begins with classic mythological flair. The gods decide to create humanity. Why? Not out of love, not to spread joy, but because the gods are tired of working. Yes, you heard that right. The earliest surviving Sumerian creation story suggests that humans were invented as divine interns to manage irrigation, feed the gods through offerings, and generally handle the chores of mortal existence. There's something refreshingly honest about that. No pretense, no Edenic innocence, just, you will be born, and you will work. Welcome to Earth. The Eridu Genesis also includes a version of the Great Flood, yes, another one which interrupts the divine-human arrangement. Ziusudra, the flood survivor, receives immortality afterward, and that seems to be where the story was headed, before the rest of the tablet crumbled into dust and took the ending with it. What we're left with is a cosmic prologue without a main act. Creation, labor, destruction, redemption then. Nothing. No explanation of the gods' motivations. No aftermath. No divine commentary. Just silence. This fragmentary nature makes interpretation a speculative art form. Some scholars argue that the myth centers on divine disappointment with humanity. Others say it's a metaphor for the cyclical nature of civilization. Still others point to its connections with later Babylonian and biblical narratives, suggesting it's part of a much larger web of inherited cosmology. But the real mystery isn't just what's missing, it's why. Why did this story survive only in pieces? Was it suppressed? Forgotten? Or did the Sumerians simply move on, leaving behind their oldest myth like a prototype too raw to publish? And if you think that descent into cosmic silence is unsettling, hold on, because the next myth sends a goddess into the literal underworld, strips her naked at every gate, and then asks what resurrection really costs. The descent of Inana and its ritualistic implications. If there's one Sumerian myth that reads like a fever dream staged as a symbolic opera, it's the descent of Inana. It's a tale that's equal parts cosmic thriller, theological horror story, and an ancient TED Talk on power, mortality, and the fine print in spiritual contracts. Inanna, the queen of heaven, goddess of love and war, decides to descend into the underworld to visit her sister, Ereshkigal, the Goth goddess of death who runs the House of Darkness, and absolutely does not do surprise visits. Inana dresses in full divine regalia, crown, necklace, rings, breastplate, and approaches the gates of Kur like someone trying to crash an exclusive party with every VIP badge possible. But the underworld doesn't care about divine fashion. At each of the 7 gates, she's forced to remove a piece of her attire. By the time she reaches the throne room, she's naked, humbled, and utterly powerless. Ereshkigal kills her on the spot. Yes, the main goddess of the pantheon dies halfway through the myth. No warning, just ritual execution. Her corpse is hung on a hook. The gods above panic. The world begins to unravel. Crops fail. Desire disappears. Everything goes gray. Eventually, Inana is rescued thanks to clever emissaries and some serious backroom divine deals, but she doesn't get to leave for free. Someone has to take her place. Inana picks her husband, Dumuzi, who had the audacity to enjoy her absence a little too much. He gets dragged down to Kur in her stead. Because love, in Sumer, comes with debt collection. The story is rich with layers. On the surface, it's a myth of death and rebirth, a seasonal metaphor, a theological meditation on descent and return. But underneath, it's about power, how it's lost, how it's negotiated, how even gods aren't immune to cosmic bureaucracy. Ritualistically, scholars suspect this myth was tied to temple performances, reenactments of fertility cycles, mourning rites, or royal ceremonies, but no one knows for sure. The emotional complexity of the story transcends function. It's not just a ritual text. It's a psychological drama about boundaries, vulnerability, and survival. And if Inanna's descent into death doesn't make you question identity, the next mystery will, because the Sumerians had a very particular way of referring to themselves. And it wasn't Sumerian. The role of Sag-Gig-Ga, the blackheaded people, in self-identification. The Sumerians had a term for themselves, Sag-Gig-Ga literally translated as the blackheaded people, which, on the surface, seems simple enough, a descriptor, a poetic way of saying, we're the folks with dark hair. But as with most things Sumerian, it's not just about hair, it's never just about hair. In countless inscriptions and hymns, kings refer to themselves as shepherds of the black-headed people. Gods are said to bless or punish the black-headed people. Laws are proclaimed for them. Rituals are performed on their behalf. It's a term of collective identity, but wrapped in layers of ambiguity. Because when the Sumerians say, black-headed, are they distinguishing themselves from someone else? If so, who? Some have suggested it's merely a physical descriptor, useful in a multi-ethnic landscape where neighbors, Akkadians, Elamites, Amorites, may have had differing traits. Others argue that the phrase is more than physical, it's cultural, a kind of Sumerian us versus them, designating not just what they looked like, but how they lived, worshipped, and obeyed the divine order. Still others read it as religious language. The term appears frequently in temple texts, where it seems to mark out the faithful, the God-fearing, temple-attending, festival-chanting masses who knew their place in the cosmic pyramid. There's also an eerie universality to it. Rarely do Sumerian texts acknowledge ethnic diversity within their cities. The Sag-Gig-Ga are presented as a monolith, unified under gods and kings, organized into roles, ready for harvests, wars, or ceremonial grief. It's a portrait of society that leaves little room for nuance or dissent. But here's the kicker. For all the times we see black-headed people in the texts, we never see what they thought of themselves on a personal level. There are no first-person diaries, no philosophical musings, only proclamations from the top down. The Sag-Gig-Ga are always being led, judged, protected, or punished. Never speaking for themselves. So was the term a badge of cultural pride? A mechanism of divine branding? or a polite euphemism for the tax base. Whatever it meant, the phrase became a durable shorthand for civilization itself, Sumerian life in all its obedient, hierarchical, temple-funded glory. And if that civil identity seems tightly wound, the next mystery stretches the Sumerian footprint much farther to stone inscriptions in a place where they officially shouldn't be. The Dog River inscriptions and their broader historical context. On the coast of modern-day Lebanon, carved into a cliff face above the restless sea, sits a strange collection of inscriptions, some in Egyptian, some in Assyrian, some in languages that came much later, and, among them, possibly Sumerian markings, or at least Proto-Mesopotamian. The site is called Nar al-Kalb, or Dog River, and it's a place where ancient empires like to leave their autographs like narcissistic backpackers with stone chisels. But what were Sumerian, or even vaguely Sumerian messages doing there? Here's where the scholars start fidgeting. Some propose that these inscriptions point to an earlier wave of Mesopotamian influence along the Levantine coast. That maybe, just maybe, trade, conquest, or religious pilgrimage extended farther than our tidy maps suggest. Others insist that these markings have been misattributed, borrowed symbols, later emulations, or simply over-eager archaeologists seeing what they want to see. But still, the mystery lingers. How did Sumerian-like inscriptions end up carved in a region they were never supposed to reach? There's no known military campaign that far west from early Sumer. No epic that mentions sea voyages or coastal colonies. No temple hymn praising the gods of the Mediterranean breeze. And yet, the stylistic similarities can't be entirely dismissed. Certain signs resemble early cuneiform. Certain arrangements echo administrative styles. It's as if someone with a Sumerian education or imitation of one stood there, chisel in hand, and decided that this rock face needed a message in the language of the old cities. Were they traders marking a boundary? Priests making a dedication? Exiles trying to preserve their cultural memory in a foreign land? Or was it simply a case of cultural leakage where the prestige of Sumerian script traveled farther than the actual cities themselves? Either way, the Dog River inscriptions remind us that boundaries in the ancient world were not as solid as we like to believe. Civilizations drifted, collided, and left fragments behind sometimes where they had no right to be. And if you find the idea of a Sumerian carving his name into a Lebanese cliff mildly baffling, wait until you see what they carved on a stone slab to celebrate a war with vultures, severed heads, and a very passive-aggressive god, the Vulture stele and its graphic depiction of warfare. Picture this: a 6-foot-tall limestone slab carved with scenes of battle so vivid you can practically hear the bones crunch. Welcome to the Vulture stele, a brutal visual report from the front lines of a Sumerian city-state turf war. It's not just a monument, it's a message. And the message is, mess with Lagash, and you end up headless in a decorative pile. The Vulture stele commemorates a 25th century BCE conflict between the rival cities of Lagash and Umma neighbors, who apparently couldn't agree on where a canal should start and end. Instead of mediation, they chose the traditional Mesopotamian solution: war, divine threats, and a commemorative slab with vultures eating corpses. On one side of the stele, the king of Lagash Enedum is shown leading troops into battle in tight formation, armed with spears and terrifying discipline. On the other, gods intervene. Ninurta, the war god, drags an enemy in a net. The dead are stacked like meat. Vultures pick at them, as if summoned by a celestial lunch bell. It's graphic, it's violent, and it's propaganda, pure and simple. The message isn't just that Lagash won. It's that Lagash was justified, divinely backed, and totally within its rights to obliterate its neighbors. But why such a public, gruesome display? Why the vultures? Some think the birds symbolize divine justice, nature's cleanup crew validating the victory. Others see it as psychological warfare, meant to terrify Umma and anyone else contemplating insubordination. The gods didn't just approve of the massacre, they feasted on it. And the artistry isn't just brutality for shock value. The stele also includes geometric patterns, regimental arrangements, and legal inscriptions. It's a blend of art, law, and theology. A public statement, courtroom evidence, and sermon, all etched into one morbid billboard. What makes the stele even more unsettling is how it blends the sacred with the grotesque. It doesn't separate war and worship. It fuses them. The battlefield is the altar. The dead are offerings. And the gods? They're not watching from above, they're participating. And speaking of gods getting involved in everything, let's take a look at how the Sumerians tried to organize their chaotic divine family tree. Spoiler, it's even more convoluted than it sounds. The N=Anu god list and the organization of the pantheon. Imagine a divine Excel spreadsheet, updated across centuries, cross-referenced by temple priests, and featuring no fewer than hundreds of deities, each with their own titles, duties, and overlapping skill sets. Welcome to the N=Anu god list, an ancient Sumerian attempt to bring order to the divine chaos they themselves had unleashed. This wasn't just a list, it was theology meets bureaucracy. The name An=Anu itself is a clue the Sumerian sky god An becomes Anu in Akkadian, and the list acts as a kind of theological Rosetta Stone, translating and aligning the divine hierarchies of different city-states and even different eras. It was how temple scribes said, "Oh, your local storm god? Yeah, we call him Ishkur, but he's basically the same as Adad." On the surface, it's a list of equivalencies, sorting gods by function and rank. At the top sits An or Anu, the sky god and divine figurehead. Below him, a cascading pyramid of power: Enlil, air and kingship; Enki, water and wisdom; Ninhursag, motherhood, and so on, down to the dozens, then hundreds of minor deities managing things like grain, copper smelting, beer, dreams, and who knows what else. There were even deities for doors, scribes, and brick molds. Nothing was too trivial for divine oversight. But why create such a list? Because in Sumer, religion was not just belief, it was infrastructure. Every temple, city, and king had their preferred deities, and reconciling those differences meant power, stability, and smooth diplomatic relations. If you could show that your war god was equivalent to your neighbors, you had a theological bridge. If your goddess of fertility and their goddess of agriculture were really just two names for the same entity, no one had to fight over sacrifices. At the same time, the list was a subtle assertion of cultural dominance. By compiling and categorizing the gods, the Sumerians claimed control over divine legitimacy. They were the archivists of divinity, the keepers of cosmic order, even as their own cities feuded and their temples hoarded power. But what's most telling about the An=Anu list is what it admits. The gods were not consistent, not across time, not across geography, not even within the same city. And so the priests compiled, corrected, and canonized. And we're still left wondering whether they understood their pantheon or just agreed to manage it like a messy divine library. And as for divine expression, let's shift from stone to sound, because the Sumerians weren't just worshipping through tablets. They were playing something strange, sacred, and now lost: the earliest forms of Sumerian music and musical instruments. Somewhere, buried beneath centuries of dust, a harp's last breath lingers. The Sumerians didn't just invent writing, bureaucracy, and the first known beer recipe, they also made music. And like everything else they touched, they turned it into something cosmic, sacred, and suspiciously hard to reconstruct. We know they had instruments. Archaeologists have uncovered lyres, harps, flutes, drums often buried with the dead, as if the afterlife required a solid house band. The most famous example is the bull-headed lyre from the royal tombs of Ur, an elaborate instrument adorned with gold, lapis lazuli, and the calm expression of a bull that has seen things. It suggests that music wasn't just background noise. It was ritual, symbolism, and performance rolled into one. But what did it sound like? That's the mystery. We have no sheet music, no surviving melodies. The tuning systems are debated. The scales are unknown. Some tablets hint at string arrangements and mathematical ratios, but these references are cryptic at best, vague footnotes in the margins of ancient rituals. What we do have are visual depictions, musicians playing before kings, in temples, even on the battlefield. Music clearly had a role in courtly life, religious ceremonies, and probably long nights of bureaucratic regret. Some images even show ensembles, suggesting group performances, early orchestration, perhaps, with reed pipes, percussion, and lyres, creating a haunting chorus for the gods. And yet, there's something ghostly about all of it. The instruments remain, but the notes are silent. The context lost. Was this music meant to please the gods? To accompany hymns? To drive out demons? Or just to entertain Sumerian nobles after a long day of supervising barley inventories? There's even speculation that music was believed to influence the divine realm, that certain sounds, rhythms, or harmonies could summon deities, calm their wrath, or realign the cosmic order. If true, that would make Sumerian musicians not just performers, but ritual technicians, sacred DJs of the Bronze Age. But whether they were priests, entertainers, or something in between, their music echoed through every aspect of society. It was the background track to myth, labor, celebration, and death. And while we may never hear their melodies, we can read their stories, including one where a scribe has a really bad day at school and writes it all down in furious, clay-smashing detail. The Sumerian school days, text, and its portrayal of education. Let's be honest. When we think of ancient education, we imagine wise elders passing on sacred wisdom in quiet temple courtyards. What we don't picture is a stressed-out student getting caned for bad handwriting while trying not to cry into his lunch tablet. But that's exactly what we get in the hilariously bleak School Days text, a first-hand account of what it was like to be a student in Sumer. And spoiler alert, it sucked. The protagonist is a young apprentice scribe, and his day starts early. He's up at dawn, dragging himself to the Adapa, the tablet house, or Sumerian school where he spends hours hunched over clay, copying signs under the judgmental eyes of his instructor. And that's just the warm-up. The text outlines an entire day of memorization, recitation, and relentless correction. If he writes a sign wrong, he's whipped. Talks too much? Whipped. Writes too slowly? Whipped. It's a pedagogical model best described as extreme tough love with a stylus. There's also the social dynamic. The students are ranked. Some are favorites. Others get mocked. Everyone's trying to please the teacher, the school father, who is less a kindly mentor and more a terrifying gatekeeper of literacy. But beneath the corporal punishment and clay anxiety lies something remarkable. Ambition. The student wants to master writing. He wants to graduate. He wants to become a scribe, a career that, in Sumer, was a golden ticket to status, power, and a lifetime of sitting indoors correcting other people's spelling errors. And the story ends not in despair, but in celebration. After a long day of brutal instruction, the student is praised, rewarded, and told he's on his way to becoming a real scholar. It's a Sumerian underdog story, how I learned to stop complaining and love the tablet. The School Days text isn't just a diary, it's propaganda. It teaches future scribes that suffering is part of the path, that writing isn't just a skill, it's a calling, a sacred duty, a badge of civilization. And if writing is sacred, then law is divine. Which brings us to the man who tried to turn morality into legislation centuries before Hammurabi ever dreamed of it. the Code of Ur-Nammu and its legal innovations. Long before Hammurabi carved his code into stone and into the collective memory of every high school history student, there was Ur-Nammu, king of Ur and unsung legislative pioneer. His code, written around 2100 BCE, is the earliest known law code in the world. That's right. The first time someone thought, hey, maybe we should actually write this stuff down before someone accuses a goat. It was under Ur-Nammu's reign. And unlike later law codes, which favored dramatic punishments and cosmic retribution, Ur-Nammu's laws are surprisingly reasonable. Steal something, pay a fine, commit bodily harm, compensation. Lie in court, a little more serious, but still not instant execution. In fact, capital punishment is rare in this code, and when it does appear, it's reserved for crimes like murder or adultery. You know, the real crowd pleasers. This suggests that Sumerian law, at least under Ur-Nammu, wasn't driven solely by vengeance or divine terror. It was based on restitution, on the idea of balance. Wrongdoing created imbalance. Justice meant restoration, not spectacle. You didn't throw someone into a river to see if the gods liked them. You calculated damages and negotiated compensation like a divine accountant with a conscience. The code was written in Sumerian, which already tells us something about its intended audience. This wasn't just for the gods or for royal vanity, it was for scribes, judges, officials, and probably that one guy in the market who always tried to overcharge for fish. It was a tool of social control, yes, but also a framework for civic identity. And the laws weren't abstract, they were specific. If a man knocks out another man's tooth, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina of silver. No vague moralizing, just clear instructions. Almost absurdly specific, like someone had seen that exact dental drama play out one too many times. But even here, mystery seeps in. We don't have the full code, just fragments. Some laws survive, others are missing entirely. We don't know how they were enforced, how often they were revised, or how much discretion judges had. And we certainly don't know how many bribes were disguised as temple donations. Still, Ur-Nammu laid the groundwork. He made justice something that could be read, debated, amended, or at least argued over in clay. And speaking of arguing with the gods, sometimes the Sumerians didn't wait for divine signs. They manufactured them. The nature of divination practices. The Sumerians didn't believe in chance. If the king tripped on the temple stairs, it wasn't a clumsy sandal, it was an omen, a warning, a divine performance critique. And rather than shrug and move on, the Sumerians developed an entire science, or pseudoscience, depending on your patience for ritualistic liver inspection, around the art of divination. This wasn't fortune-telling for fun. This was policy. Before battles, during famines, even for choosing the right date to start a building project, decisions weren't made until the gods had weighed in, and often the gods had to be coaxed into responding. There were multiple techniques. The most famous is extispicy, the examination of a sacrificed animal's entrails, especially the liver. A trained diviner, Baru priest, would study every bump, groove, and blemish on the liver, comparing it to standardized models that mapped out divine messages like a celestial user manual. This wrinkle? Your enemies are plotting. That dark spot? Don't trust your allies. Missing a gallbladder? Probably cursed. Then there were dreams. Dreams weren't idle brain static, they were nightly telegrams from the gods, but only if interpreted correctly. Enter the dream interpreters, who collected case studies of past dreams and outcomes, creating massive clay databases of symbolic meaning. A lion in your dream? Good, unless it bites you. Then bad. Unless it bites someone else. Then maybe good again. Another method was casting lots, or interpreting signs in oil poured into water. Think of it as Sumerian lava lamp prophecy. Bubbles, patterns, the way the oil swirled all were read like divine poetry. Every flicker meant something. But here's the kicker. Despite the ritual complexity, these practices were highly formalized. Diviners used manuals, trained for years, and operated in a structured system. Divination wasn't mystical freelancing, it was a licensed profession, often state-sanctioned. You didn't just wing it. You filled out the correct forms, consulted the appropriate omens, and followed procedure. Of course, that doesn't mean the gods always cooperated. Sometimes the signs were contradictory. Sometimes they said nothing. And sometimes they told you what you didn't want to hear, which was, conveniently, when kings started consulting other diviners until someone said, "Yes, build the ziggurat." So they sought signs everywhere, in livers, in lightning, in dreams. But when the signs failed and kingdoms crumbled, only poetry remained to weep for the ruins, to curse the gods, and to document the loss. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur. When Sumer fell, it didn't go quietly. It went with a wail carved in cuneiform, soaked in ash, and read aloud in temple after temple like a ritualized eulogy for the soul of a dying world. Enter the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur, a masterpiece of grief and accusation that doesn't just mourn a city, it accuses the heavens of betrayal. This wasn't a casual poem, it was liturgy, theater, political commentary, a public processing of trauma written in the voice of the gods themselves. Temples burned, statues were defiled. The gods abandoned their shrines, priests wept, mothers tore their hair. And through it all, the narrative insistently asks, why did this happen? The answer isn't straightforward. The poem blames Sumer's kings for arrogance. Yes, but it also blames the gods for allowing it, or worse, orchestrating it. The language walks a line between reverence and rage. Enlil, once the protector of Ur, is now portrayed as the one who authorized its destruction. The storm that leveled the city was divine. The silence afterward was divine. Even the absence of intervention was divine. It's unsettling theology. The gods giveth, the gods taketh away, and sometimes they do it just to make a point. But beneath the divine drama lies a very human sorrow. The poem is filled with vivid, almost cinematic imagery. Smoke rising from ziggurats, rivers running black with ash, streets littered with the dead. It doesn't just recount history, it forces you to feel it. The loss of civic identity, the rupture of trust, the spiritual confusion that comes when your entire worldview is buried under rubble. Scholars believe this lament was recited in ceremonies meant to mourn and perhaps even ritually repair the moral universe, like a cosmic appeal. Yes, we failed, but surely we've suffered enough. Can we rebuild now? And perhaps that's why the poem endures, not because of its historical accuracy, but because of its emotional truth. Civilizations fall, people grieve, and sometimes the only thing left standing is a line of poetry scorched into clay. But amid the ashes and grief, in the ruins of temples and homes, archaeologists began to find something small, crude, and profoundly puzzling. Figurines tucked into corners, as if someone hoped fear itself could be molded and stopped. The function of Kudu Amuru figures, tucked into niches, buried beneath thresholds, or awkwardly placed in corners of Sumerian houses, Kudu Amuru figures appear like clay ghosts, crude, humanoid, and deeply ambiguous. These little figurines aren't majestic. They're not finely detailed. They weren't displayed proudly on pedestals. In fact, they seem like something you might step on in the dark and mistake for a weird-looking potato. But they weren't garbage. These figurines were placed deliberately, ritualistically, like spiritual tripwires designed to protect, ward off, or maybe contain something. Were they offerings? Warnings? Magic? Emotional placeholders? Welcome to one of the most unsettling material mysteries in Mesopotamian archaeology. The name Kudu Amuru is itself misleading. It fuses names from later periods Canaanite and Syrian influences with earlier Sumerian claycraft, hinting that these figurines likely outlived their original context. But it's in the Sumerian domestic layer that their presence is especially bizarre. These weren't found in temples, they weren't royal, they were homegrown. That's what makes them so intimate and so eerie. Most of the figures are misshapen. Some are just blobs with eyes. Others have rudimentary arms, large hips, or what may be exaggerated genitalia. They're often found alone, but sometimes in pairs or clusters, hidden like secrets. And if that feels like the plot of a horror movie, well, you're not far off. Some scholars think they were apotropaic objects meant to ward off evil, like Sumerian voodoo dolls, but without the pins. Others suggest they were part of fertility rituals, stand-ins for prayers, symbolic placeholders for babies hoped for or children lost. A few suggest they might even represent household gods miniature, unnamed deities with jurisdiction over plumbing and pestilence. But here's the rub. They almost never come with inscriptions. No labels, no prayers, no, if lost, return to Enki, just silent, staring lumps of symbolic clay. As if their power lay precisely in their unknowability. And that, more than anything, is what unnerves scholars the most. These were important enough to be placed carefully and forgotten carefully. Were they personal? Was there a standardized ritual? Or was every family winging it, hoping their clay creation would please whatever cosmic entity checked domestic security? We may never know. And maybe we're not supposed to. Some things were meant to work invisibly like myths themselves. And the myth we're heading into next isn't a single story, it's all the stories. Because when the Sumerians told of creation, they didn't just tell one tale, they told several, and they never quite agreed. The Sumerian creation myth, various versions. If you're looking for a clean, bullet-pointed Sumerian version of In the Beginning, prepare to be disappointed or delighted, depending on how much you enjoy theological chaos. Because, unlike other ancient cultures that tried to consolidate their cosmology into one streamlined origin myth, the Sumerians looked at the beginning of time and thought, why have one version when you can have 12? We're not talking about minor differences in character names or small interpretative flourishes. These Sumerian creation myths are genuinely, fundamentally different from one another. Sometimes humans are created from clay, sometimes from blood, sometimes as workers, sometimes as cosmic accidents. In one version, Enki and Ninmah sculpt people in a divine workshop and accidentally create a list of disabled humans, prompting a debate over whether those individuals still have value. Spoiler, the gods disagree. In another version, creation comes through divine copulation gods, begetting more gods who then begat rivers, cities, stars, and maybe a king or two. Elsewhere, the world begins in a watery abyss, and the separation of sky and earth takes place like a cosmic divorce settlement, with Enlil playing both mediator and instigator. What's strange is that the Sumerians didn't seem bothered by these contradictions. They weren't obsessed with consistency the way later monotheistic traditions became. For them, truth was modular, contextual, and often contradictory by design. Different temples preserved different versions, each with their local gods and starring roles. Creation wasn't just about origins, it was about who got credit for what, and which city's theology could claim divine legitimacy. And then there's the tone. Some creation myths are deeply sacred, others are almost comedic. Divine beings mess up, things go wrong. One deity tries to create humans and accidentally invents infertility. Another builds a city, only for the gods to abandon it a few chapters later. These aren't just stories, they're blueprints for civilization, filled with poetic ambiguities and cosmic sarcasm. They reflect how the Sumerians saw the world, as something beautiful, flawed, cyclical, and always one divine mistake away from unraveling. So which version is correct? None. Or all. That's the point. But if you're still searching for a single, tidy myth, you might like the next one. a classic hero's journey featuring forests, monsters, ecological collapse, and one very uninvited lumberjack. The Gilgamesh and Humbaba narrative's ecological message. You'd think that Gilgamesh, the great king of Uruk and Mesopotamia's most famous existentialist, would have better things to do than pick a fight with a forest spirit. But no. In this story, Gilgamesh and his best friend Enkidu venture into the cedar forest to kill Huwawa, aka Humbaba, a terrifying monster appointed by the gods to guard nature's most sacred grove. Why? Well, because it's there. This isn't just a monster hunt. It's an early epic wrapped in layers of spiritual ambiguity and unspoken guilt. The Gilgamesh and Huwawa narrative is often portrayed as a simple tale of conquest, but the deeper you dig, the more it reads like an ancient environmental allegory with a tragic punchline. Gilgamesh and Enkidu march into the forest with divine weapons and no particular justification. They slay Huwawa, who pleads for his life, and proceed to chop down the sacred trees. The forest, once protected and alive, is reduced to lumber. Gilgamesh uses the wood to build city gates. Progress, civilization, victory. Cue the Sumerian victory anthem. But underneath this triumph lies a moral unease. The poem lingers on Huwawa's humanity. He cries, he begs. He's not portrayed as a rampaging beast, but as a servant of the gods doing his job. His death feels wrong, and at island, because afterward everything begins to fall apart. Enkidu has disturbing dreams, Gilgamesh starts spiraling, and the gods, they're not pleased. Some scholars see this as one of the earliest surviving critiques of anthropocentric arrogance. Man confronts nature, wins, and is punished for it. There's no celebration of domination, only a creeping dread that something irreplaceable has been lost. Sound familiar? Others read it as a meditation on mortality and hubris. Killing Huwawa doesn't make Gilgamesh stronger. It makes him aware that death is inevitable, that gods are distant, and that cutting down what you don't understand comes at a cost. Whatever the interpretation, the story refuses to let the hero off easy. The cedar forest doesn't grow back. The monster doesn't resurrect. And Gilgamesh, the supposed victor, returns home a little less certain, a little more haunted. And if forests could die, what about dreams? What about visions? What secrets were buried in the messages that came at night, when even gods whispered through the mind? The meaning of dream interpretation in Sumerian culture. In the Sumerian cosmos, dreams weren't accidental. They weren't just your subconscious processing the day's goat inventory or expressing anxiety about unpaid barley loans. No, dreams were mail from the gods delivered nightly, often with zero context and maximum symbolic drama. They could mean divine favor, looming doom, or the need to sacrifice a sheep by moonlight. The challenge was figuring out which. To the Sumerians, a dream was never just a dream. It was a message encoded in symbols, and interpreting it wasn't a casual affair. It was a job, a science, and probably a source of personal dread. If your king woke up shouting about a burning fig tree, someone had to be summoned at once to explain whether this meant war, pestilence, or that he should avoid figs for a week. Enter the dream interpreters, trained specialists who operated like theological psychiatrists with a backlog of case files. They worked with large collections of dream omens, essentially early manuals that recorded patterns, outcomes, and divine logic. If a man dreams of water rising over his head, it means wealth, unless the water is muddy, in which case it means death. Straightforward, right? These tablets listed thousands of dreams and their potential meanings, often using a system of analogies and metaphors that would make a modern Jungian sweat. Dreams of lions meant courage or betrayal. Dreams of eating meant contentment or hunger. Dreams of one's teeth falling out? Well, that's been terrifying people since at least 2500 BCE. But dreams weren't all doom and gloom. They also offered guidance, Many Sumerian heroes received crucial information in dreams, battle plans, divine instructions, even prophecies. The gods used dreams the way we use text messages: brief, confusing, and frequently misinterpreted. There was also a clear hierarchy. Not all dreams were divine in origin. Some were said to come from demons, others from personal anxiety, and only the best true dreams came directly from the gods. Distinguishing them was crucial. Misreading a divine dream could doom an entire city, but getting it right, that could change history. Of course, none of this stopped kings from cherry-picking interpretations. If 3 dreams warned against a military campaign and one said, "Go forth and conquer," guess which one made the press release? Dreams were a gamble, a responsibility, a divine whisper wrapped in metaphor. And when the gods weren't sending visions, they were demanding something more permanent: monuments, rituals, architecture. Welcome to the eagle, the temple that wasn't just a building, but a cosmic node. The concept of eagle, the great house temple. In Sumer, a temple was not just a place to light incense and chant a few hymns. It was the eagle, the great house. And calling it a house wasn't metaphorical, it was architectural theology. A temple was where the god literally lived, ate, slept, received visitors, collected rent in the form of offerings, and occasionally ignored you for reasons known only to the divine. Every city had one, and each eagle was designed to reflect the god it housed. The Temple of Enlil in Nippur was a commanding structure, orderly, enormous, and echoing the god's obsession with cosmic law. The Temple of Inana in Uruk, by contrast, was probably a little more dramatic, sensual, and difficult to budget for. These buildings weren't neutral. They were physical embodiments of personality, power, and politics. But temples were more than divine apartments. They were economic engines, landowners, employers, banks, warehouses. Everything flowed through them: grain, silver, labor, law. When you offered a goat to the goddess, it wasn't just devotion, it was a tax. And somewhere, a scribe was making 3 copies of the receipt. The eagle was also a node in the divine internet, a communication center between earth and heaven. Rituals performed inside had real consequences. If the priest missed a step, crops failed. If the offerings were flawed, disease. If a king skipped his festival obligations. Let's just say history was not kind to monarchs who forgot the gods' birthdays. And the buildings themselves were symbolic. Their foundations reached down into the underworld. Their roofs pointed toward the heavens. Their walls were layered with cosmic meaning. To step into an eagle was to step between worlds through a space carefully engineered to reflect the divine order. Even the layout mattered. Rooms were arranged hierarchically. Access was restricted based on status. Only the high priest could enter the innermost sanctum, where the god's statue resided, often dressed, perfumed, and fed like royalty. Whether the gods actually inhabited these statues is unclear, but the rituals made them real, and in a world built on divine presence, that was enough. Yet, despite all this sacred opulence, something more mysterious lingered behind the gilded doors. The chants, the spells, the murmured words that no one outside the walls was meant to hear. Because the eagle didn't just house gods, it housed magic. The incantation literature and its magical practices. If you were a Sumerian and your crops failed, your cow miscarried, your husband coughed ominously, or your child had disturbing dreams about snakes, you didn't just panic. You performed an incantation, a carefully crafted, ritually charged piece of magical literature that functioned like a voice memo to the gods and demons, asking them politely or not to cut it out. Sumerian incantation texts are some of the most hauntingly poetic documents ever etched in clay. They weren't dry checklists or theological essays. They were literary spells rich with rhythm, repetition, metaphor, and an unnerving blend of terror and hope. They named diseases as demons, named demons as trespassers, and asked the gods to intervene by threatening to invoke even worse gods. Most incantations followed a pattern: identification of the problem, naming of the offender, which was often something like the evil wind, the venomous mouth, or the demon who rides the scream, and a series of commands or pleas to banish it. These weren't whispered either. They were chanted, sung, repeated, sometimes hundreds of times, over fires, over water, over the sick. There were different classes of incantations too. Some were apotropaic, meant to prevent evil. Others were curative, for those already afflicted. And then there were the truly terrifying ones, designed to reverse curses or send plagues hurtling back at their source. You didn't just use those casually. You called a specialist, a priest, exorcist, a shipru. These priests were part medic, part shaman, part linguistic magician. They wielded words like weapons, combining them with rituals involving oils, figurines, water libations, and sacrifice. Their job wasn't just to appease the gods, it was to confront the supernatural and win. But here's the wild part. Many of these spells were standardized. They were copied across cities and generations, suggesting a shared belief system, a kind of magical canon, and they were always updated. New demons, new verses, plague outbreak, time for a rewrite. Still, the texts never guarantee success. There's always an undercurrent of uncertainty. Magic, for the Sumerians, was never fully in human control. It was borrowed power, leased language. And it worked only as long as the gods were willing to listen. And in the beginning, they did listen because humans were made by gods, created, shaped, and flawed, sometimes for better, often for worse. And that flawed creation is where we're heading next. The Enki and Ninma, myth and the creation of humanity. Imagine being invented by two bored gods with bad teamwork and a questionable sense of humor. That's basically the setup in the Enki and Ninma myth, a creation story that reads like divine improv night gone wildly off script. In this narrative, the goddess Ninma and the trickster god Enki sit down to solve the problem of divine labor by creating humans. The problem? The gods are tired of working. The solution? Delegation. And thus, humanity is born out of divine laziness and questionable design ethics. The myth starts with celebration. The gods are drunk, the mood is festive, and someone says, "Hey, let's make people." Classic mistake. What follows is a bizarre game of biological one-upmanship, with Enki and Ninma creating humans with various deformities and disabilities. A man who can't walk, another who can't hold his bladder, one who can't speak, another who can't have children. Each is presented like a failed prototype in a startup pitch gone wrong. And then it gets darker. Ninma, frustrated with Enki's smugness, creates a human so defective that even Enki can't find a societal role for him. The myth ends not with a triumphant creation of ideal humans, but with a sobering realization: divine power has limits. Creation is flawed. There is no undo button. Interpretations vary. On one hand, this could be a tragicomic reflection of human imperfection, a recognition that not everyone fits into the neat boxes of labor, function, and divine utility. On the other hand, it might be a biting satire of the gods themselves, flawed creators bumbling their way through moral responsibility like drunk architects with too much clay and too little foresight. Either way, the myth is unsettlingly modern. It deals with disability, failure, hubris, and the ethics of creation. It doesn't moralize. It doesn't explain. It just presents and leaves the audience to feel the discomfort. What makes this story especially haunting is its apparent emotional detachment. The humans created aren't comforted, healed, or saved. They're examples, points in an argument, reminders that divine mistakes are permanent and that mortals will live with the consequences forever. And just when you think the divine messiness couldn't get any more interpersonal, along comes a myth about love, marriage, and the awkward politics of inviting yourself into someone else's tribe. The Marriage of Martu myth and its cultural insights. Now, imagine your gods are debating intermarriage and social mobility. That's the vibe of the Marriage of Martu, a myth about a foreign god from the western deserts, the Amorite god Martu, who crashes Sumerian society and, somehow, walks away with a bride and a seat at the sacred dinner table. It's not just a wedding. It's a theological identity crisis wrapped in ceremony and cosmic side-eye. Martu, the outsider, represents everything the Sumerians disliked: nomadism, lack of hygiene, eating raw meat, and generally not understanding how cities work. In the myth, he shows up in a Sumerian city and falls in love with the daughter of a prominent local man. Cue the social awkwardness. The locals are scandalized. He doesn't plow, he doesn't sew, he doesn't know the proper temple etiquette. Translation: this guy doesn't even know how to use a bathhouse. But despite their grumbling, the marriage goes forward. The bride accepts. The union is sealed. And the myth ends not in rejection, but in accommodation. Martu, though foreign, becomes part of the divine family. He's not forced to change who he island. Instead, the myth reconfigures the boundaries of cultural belonging. On the surface, it's a simple love story, but beneath it simmers a deep cultural tension. The Sumerians were facing real-world interactions with the Amorites, semi-nomadic people from the west, who were increasingly settling in Mesopotamian cities and slowly becoming part of the ruling class. This myth isn't just about gods falling in love, it's about Sumerians trying to figure out how much cultural mixing is too much, and whether barbarians can become brothers-in-law. Some scholars argue it's a parable of acceptance. Others see it as subtle critique. Martu never becomes civilized in the Sumerian sense. He doesn't adopt agriculture or city-based rituals. But he's still embraced. Does this suggest pluralism or resignation? And perhaps the biggest mystery is the bride herself. She says yes, but why? Is it love? Political alliance? Divine obligation? Her voice is quiet in the text, possibly too quiet. Still, the myth stands as an oddly progressive theological moment. The outsider is not cast out. He is married in, which raises the stakes for the next mystery, where the heavens themselves are no longer fixed and the stars start to speak. The astronomical observations and their precision. The Sumerians may not have had telescopes, but they definitely watched the skies like their lives depended on it, which, to be fair, they often believed they did. Stars, planets, the moon's phases, eclipses, all were catalogued, calculated, and connected to divine will. In a world where crops failed if the gods sneezed, astronomy wasn't just curiosity. It was strategy. Their observations weren't amateur hour either. The Sumerians developed complex calendrical systems, plotted celestial cycles, and linked star patterns to seasonal events with unsettling accuracy. They divided the year into 12 lunar months and adjusted their calendars to match agricultural needs. The fact that they managed all this with no telescopic equipment and plenty of clouds makes it even more impressive. Key constellations like the Pleiades, Orion, and the Big Dipper, which they likened to a bull of heaven or a plow, appeared in Sumerian star texts and omens. These weren't just night sky decorations. They were divine schedules. The stars told priests when to plant, when to harvest, when to fast, and when to panic. But here's where it gets weird. Some Sumerian texts suggest they recognized planetary movement, Venus especially. In fact, Venus appears in texts associated with Inana, aka Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, who was linked to the planet's dramatic rise and disappearance from the night sky. The connection was mythologized. When Venus vanished, Inanna descended into the underworld. When Venus rose, so did she. Cosmology as performance art. Their predictive models for lunar eclipses and solstices, though not mathematically precise by modern standards, were alarmingly competent. The sky was their cosmic spreadsheet, and they read it not just for data, but for divine sentiment. A blood-red moon, portent of war, a star's untimely flicker, a king will fall. And yet, despite all this careful mapping, the records leave gaps. We don't know how they measured things. We don't know how much was observation and how much was inherited lore. Some scholars believe there was an oral tradition lost to time. Others suspect much of the math was simply never written down. Still, the silence between the stars was never empty to the Sumerians. It was full of potential, prophecy, and precision. And speaking of prophetic voices, next comes the first known literary voice in history, a woman who dared to sing for the gods and carved her name into eternity. The temple hymns of Enheduanna and their theological depth. Before there was Homer, before there was Virgil, before there was even a word for author in most of the world, there was Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god, Nanna in Ur, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and the first person in history to sign her name to a literary work. Not bad for someone writing in cuneiform while navigating a religious bureaucracy and the political fallout of her father's empire. Her most famous work, the Temple Hymns, is a collection of 42 hymns dedicated to temples across Sumer. At first glance, they might look like standard divine praise songs, but dig deeper, and what emerges is a theologically rich, emotionally raw, and politically loaded spiritual map of a fracturing world. Each hymn doesn't just describe a temple, it invokes its spirit, its god, its civic role. Enheduanna writes as if the buildings themselves breathe, bleed, and desire. These are not cold stone structures. They're divine organs in the body of the cosmos, pulsing with ritual power. The temples are political anchors, cultural hearts, and theological testaments, all wrapped in her lyrical voice. But Enheduanna's authorship isn't just a historical footnote, it's part of the message. Her voice is not passive. She inserts herself into the cosmic hierarchy. Her poetic eye doesn't just praise, it pleads, commands, suffers, and judges. This is unprecedented. The idea that a mortal woman could both serve and challenge the gods through poetry is a disruption in the cosmic script. The hymns also subtly reflect her precarious position. As a priestess in a syncretic empire trying to unify Sumerian and Akkadian cultures, her writing operates as both devotion and diplomacy. She praises gods of rival cities. She unites diverse theologies under a poetic framework. She becomes a voice for a divinely sanctioned empire, even as it threatens to crumble around her. Modern readers often miss how radical this was. Enheduanna wasn't just composing hymns. She was inventing a theological narrative and giving it a human voice. Her work stands at the intersection of faith, politics, and authorship, and it's no accident that her name, carved in clay, survived. But even her voice couldn't speak forever. For the next generation of scribes, preservation required something else. Lists, drills, memorization. Enter the strange world of the Sumerian lexical lists, where knowledge became ritual and language was carved into eternity by sheer repetition. The Sumerian lexical lists and their educational purpose. Picture a classroom where the walls are made of sun-baked bricks, the pencils are styluses, and the whiteboards are clay slabs you can ruin with one slip of the hand. Now imagine what's being taught. Not songs, not stories, but word lists, tedious, relentless, mind-numbing word lists. Welcome to the Sumerian scribal school and its most revered teaching tool, the lexical list. These lists weren't optional. They were the foundation of scribal education. Word for word, line by line, future bureaucrats, priests, and poets alike copied and memorized every term for animals, tools, gods, body parts, plants, metals, professions, household objects, and words you didn't even know you needed. Tooth of a lion, reed basket, male prostitute, all filed neatly in semantic categories. Why? Because Sumerian was a difficult language, even for the Sumerians. It had no known relatives, relied heavily on context and nuance, and was quickly becoming a classical language, preserved more for prestige and ritual than for daily speech. The lexical lists became a kind of ark, preserving not just vocabulary but cosmic order itself. Naming things was a sacred act, a way of freezing reality into manageable units. Some lists were bilingual, pairing Sumerian with Akkadian. Others were monolingual, functioning like ancient thesauruses, inventories of synonyms or conceptually linked terms. The variety is staggering. You get everything from basic vocabulary to absurdly specific entries like thick woolen robe of the high priest who guards the city gate. But what makes them truly mysterious is their deeper purpose. They weren't just educational. They were ritualized knowledge. Copying them was an act of devotion. Their structure mirrored how the Sumerians saw the universe, ordered, hierarchical, repeatable. The lists weren't just tools for literacy, they were training and thinking like a god. The most advanced scribes didn't just memorize lists, they created new ones. They rearranged knowledge. They restructured the cosmos in clay. They played with language until it became theology. And while these lists might seem dry today, they helped shape how ancient minds thought about taxonomy, abstraction, and the relationship between words and reality. They were proto-databases, cognitive scaffolding, and divine flashcards all in one. But for all their structure and system, there were still mysteries that defied classification, like the image of gods sailing across the sky in boats, as if the stars themselves had hulls and cargo. The boat of heaven, or sky boats, mentioned in some texts. Look up at the stars. Now imagine them not as static points of light, but as celestial vessels, boats cutting across the heavens, crewed by gods, loaded with ritual meaning, and operating on a schedule older than time itself. That's the logic behind the boats of heaven, enigmatic references in Sumerian texts that hint at divine travel through the night sky, not by chariot, not by wind, but by boat. Now, before you assume the Sumerians were predicting space shuttles, calm down, but also don't entirely rule it out. The sky boat, or heavenly boat, appears in hymns, myths, and ritual texts, often associated with deities like Inana or Utu, the sun god, whose daily journey from east to west was imagined as a cosmic voyage. The metaphor wasn't just poetic, it was structural. These gods didn't float, they navigated. The heavens were a river, the constellations, their checkpoints, the horizon, a harbor. In Inanna's hymns, she is described as riding a boat of heaven, an image layered with mythological and possibly astronomical significance. Was this a reference to the planet Venus rising and setting? Or was it a metaphor for ritual procession? Or was it wildly a literal belief in star-sailing gods using divine ferries to commute across dimensions? It's hard to tell because the texts don't explain. They just mention the boats, reverently, repeatedly, and without instruction, which is very Sumerian of them. Ritually, boats also played a central role in processions. Actual barges were built to carry god statues along rivers during festivals. These sacred vessels weren't just transportation, they were liturgical stages. The god entered the boat sailed, the city watched, the heavens rejoiced. Was the celestial boat a reflection of this earthly rite, or vice versa? Or were they thought to mirror one another, heaven and earth in sacred synchronization? Some scholars read the boat of heaven as a mythological placeholder for cosmic transition, a way of symbolizing movement between worlds, divine and mortal, night and day, chaos and order. Others see it as part of an early astronomical system, a coded reference to planetary motion embedded in sacred metaphor. Whatever the truth, the image is unforgettable. Gods with oars, sailing silently through the night sky, steering the fate of the world in celestial silence. But as the stars moved and the myths drifted across time, one thing did not sail forward: the language that held it all together. And that disappearance is the final mystery. The overall disappearance of Sumerian language as a spoken tongue. For a civilization that invented writing, mapped the stars, built multi-tiered temples, and developed legal systems, while most of the world was still figuring out what to do with a wheel, the Sumerians vanished from conversation with stunning quiet. Not their stories, not their cities, not even their gods. Those persisted, adopted, adapted, passed down like heirlooms with chipped corners. But the language, the actual sounds, the grammar, the idioms, the casual grunts and oaths of everyday Sumerian speech disappeared, just stopped being spoken. Like a curtain falling on a performance no one realized was the finale. And here's the weird part. We don't know exactly when it happened. There's no dramatic collapse. No clay tablet saying, "Starting Monday, we're switching to Akkadian." The transition happened slowly, silently, insidiously. By around 2000 BCE, Akkadian, once the foreign tongue of Semitic newcomers, had become the dominant spoken language across Mesopotamia. Sumerian, once the voice of kings and contracts, slipped into ritual use. Like Latin after the fall of Rome, it became a language for priests, poets, and bureaucrats, not bakers or bricklayers. But why did it fade? Part of the answer lies in demographics. The Sumerians were gradually absorbed by the larger Akkadian-speaking population. Through intermarriage, administration, military alliances, and sheer math, Akkadian speakers became the majority. Sumerian, meanwhile, was never an easy language to begin with. It was a linguistic orphan, an isolate with no relatives, no backup plan, no helpful cognates to make the transition gentle. Another factor was prestige shift. As political power shifted north first to Akkadian cities, then to Babylon and Assyria, so did linguistic fashion. Languages, like currencies, are often measured in utility. And when the ruling class speaks something else, people follow suit. Not out of malice or betrayal, but out of necessity. You don't haggle over fish prices in the dead tongue of your great-grandfather. And yet, Sumerian never really died. Not entirely. It remained on tablets, in hymns, in curses, in rituals. Scribes still learned it, copied it, revered it. Temple libraries preserved it like sacred code, even centuries after no one had spoken it over a meal. Like Latin in the Middle Ages, it became a ghost language haunting the edges of the cultural imagination, invoked in ceremony, never quite alive, never quite dead. Today, when we read Sumerian, we do it through the eyes of the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the inheritors and interpreters. The words survive, but the voice behind them has gone quiet. And that's perhaps the greatest mystery of all, how a language that shaped civilization itself could fade without a trace of its final whisper.